My daughter-in-law used my credit to buy a $120,000 RV, then left me the bills. I found out on a Tuesday evening, standing in my own kitchen, with the phone pressed so hard against my ear that it left a mark. And the woman on the other end kept calling me Mrs. Turner like she knew me, like she had any idea what those words were about to do to my life. But before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word of this, I want to know who's sitting with me tonight. Tell me where you're watching from. Put your city in the comments. I read every one of them. I really do. It makes an old woman feel less alone telling a story like this. And if you love your grandmother the way I loved raising my boy, if you believe family should mean something, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. Now, let me tell you what she did to me. My name is Rebecca Turner. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in the house my husband and I bought in 1987, paid off in full 19 years ago. And until that Tuesday evening, my credit score was 812. 812. I know that number because I checked it every single month. Because after my husband, Harold, passed, I promised myself I would never again be a woman who didn't know exactly where she stood financially. I paid my bills on the first of the month. I clipped coupons not because I had to, but because it made me feel useful. I had exactly one credit card, a Visa with a $5,000 limit, that I used for gas and groceries, and paid off in full every cycle. That was my whole financial life. Boring. Safe. Mine. The woman on the phone identified herself as a collections representative from a finance company I had never heard of in my life. She said my account was 61 days past due. I told her she had the wrong number, the wrong Rebecca Turner. There must be 1,000 of us in this country. She read me my address, my actual address, the one I've lived at for 37 years. She read me the last 4 digits of my social security number. Correct. And then she said the words that turned my stomach to ice water. Ma'am, this account is for a 2024 Forest River Sunseeker recreational vehicle. Purchase price $119,850. Financed through our dealership partnership program. You are the primary borrower on this loan. I remember laughing. Actually laughing. A short, sharp, disbelieving laugh. Because it was so absurd. I don't own an RV. I've never wanted an RV. Harold and I went camping exactly twice in our marriage, and both times I came home with poison ivy and a permanent grudge against tents. I told her this was clearly identity theft, that I would be contacting the fraud department immediately, and I hung up the phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed my son, Gary, his breakfast every morning for 18 years. And I tried to think. Identity theft happens to people, I told myself. Strangers steal your information off the internet. They open accounts you never asked for, and there are systems in place to fix it. I would call the credit bureaus. I would file a police report. I would handle this the way I've handled everything since Harold died. Methodically, calmly, one step at a time. Except something was nagging at me. A small cold thread of dread I didn't want to pull on. Because identity thieves are usually strangers. And strangers don't know your address by heart. Strangers don't know that Harold's middle name was Eugene, which is the answer to one of my security questions. Strangers don't know your mother's maiden name unless you've told somebody. Unless somebody close to you has helped you set up your online banking. Unless somebody has sat at your kitchen table and watched you type in your own passwords because your eyes aren't what they used to be and you ask for help. I did not sleep at all that first night. I sat in Harold's old recliner, the one I still haven't been able to give away even though it doesn't match anything else in my living room anymore. And I went through every scrap of paper in my file cabinet, every statement, every receipt, looking for some explanation that made sense, some clerical error, some clue that would let me believe this was simply a computer glitch and not what my gut was already telling me it was. By 4 in the morning I had convinced myself, briefly, that it had to be a stranger, some faceless criminal operating out of a call center somewhere. Because the alternative, that someone I let sit at my table and eat my cooking had done this to me on purpose, was too much to hold in my chest all at once. I called my son Gary that same night. Gary is 41 years old, my only child. And since his father died, he's been the person I call first when something goes wrong. When the furnace makes a strange noise. When I can't figure out the new remote control. When I just want to hear a voice that sounds a little bit like Harold's did. He answered on the second ring, sounding tired the way he always sounds tired lately. And I told him what had happened. There was a silence on the line. A long one. The kind of silence that tells you more than words ever could. Mom, he finally said, let me call you back. He didn't call back. Lauren did. Lauren is my daughter-in-law. She married Gary 2 years ago in a wedding. I paid $11,000 toward because I wanted my son to have the day he deserved. Because I liked her then, or I thought I did. Because she hugged me at their engagement dinner and told me she'd always wanted a mother figure since she wasn't close with her own mother. And because my grandson Dylan, who is 4 years old and has Harold's exact laugh, calls her mommy and calls me grandma. Beck and I love that little boy more than I have loved almost anything in this world. Lauren's voice on the phone that night was calm, too calm. The kind of calm you use when you've already rehearsed what you're going to say. Rebecca, I need you to not overreact, she said. It's not what it sounds like. Explain it to me then, I said. Explain to me why. I'm being called about $120,000 recreational vehicle loan with my name on it. She sighed, the kind of sigh that suggests I was the unreasonable one in this conversation. Gary and I have been under a lot of financial stress. You know how hard the market's been for his contracting business. I found a program where family members can co-sign to get better rates. And your credit is so much stronger than ours. So I used some of your information to get us approved. I was going to tell you. I was going to add you to the account paperwork properly. I just hadn't gotten to it yet. And honestly, Rebecca, we needed the RV for Dylan. For family trips. For memories. Don't you want Dylan to have memories? I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. The way I had to sit with it that night. Don't you want Dylan to have memories? As if my $120,000 of exposure, my credit, my name, my 37 years of careful financial discipline, was a small price to pay for a woman I'd known for 3 years to have an Instagram-worthy RV parked in her driveway. You forged my signature, I said, because by then I'd already pulled up the account online using the information the collections woman had given me, and there it was. My name signed in a hand that was almost my own but not quite. The T looped wrong, the way someone signs your name when they've practiced it but never actually watched. You do it slowly enough. I didn't forge anything, Lauren said, her voice sharpening now. I filled out an application with information you'd already given us access to. That's not forgery, Rebecca. That's just how these things work sometimes. I hung up the phone. I sat alone in my kitchen until nearly 2 in the morning. And I want to tell you, the people who tell you that heartbreak is only romantic, that it only happens between lovers, they've never had a daughter-in-law look them in the eye through a phone line and explain away $120,000 like it was a rounding error. I called her back the next morning, calmer, or at least pretending to be, because I wanted to hear her say the word sorry out loud, just once, before I decided what I was going to do about any of this. She didn't say it. Instead, she launched into a long explanation about how the market for contracting work has been brutal this year, how Gary's truck needed a transmission replacement, how they'd been drowning quietly for months and hadn't wanted to worry me, how the RV wasn't actually just for fun. It was supposed to become a source of income too, something they could rent out on one of those peer-to-peer camper apps on weekends they weren't using it. A whole business plan she recited like she'd practiced it in the mirror. I asked her, very simply, why she hadn't just asked me directly. I told her I would have sat down with her and Gary, looked at the numbers, maybe even helped, if they'd only asked. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. Because you would have said no, and I couldn't take that risk, as if my right to say no to $120,000 loan in my own name was the actual problem here, the obstacle to be engineered around rather than a decision that belonged to me. I want to tell you about my friend Nancy, because she's the one who talked me down off the ledge that week, the one who sat across from me at the diner we've gone to every Wednesday since our husbands were both still alive. and listened to me cry into a cup of coffee that went cold twice. Before I finished telling her the whole story, Nancy is a retired school teacher, sharp as a tack, and she told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Rebecca, you have spent your whole life being the reasonable one, the one who smooths things over, the one who writes the check so nobody has to feel bad. This time, do not write the check. Just this once. Let someone else feel the weight of what they've done." I didn't know yet exactly what that would look like, but sitting in that diner booth, I made a quiet promise to myself that I intended to keep. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell that I don't think people understand until they've lived it. I filed a fraud claim with the finance company. I was told that because the application included my correct social security number, my correct address, and answers to security questions, that only I or someone with intimate knowledge of my life would know. The case would need to go through an extensive investigation, and in the meantime, the account would remain on my credit report as past due. My score, my beautiful 812, dropped to 611 within one billing cycle. I got a letter denying me for a home equity line of credit I hadn't even known I might need, until I tried to get one to cover an upcoming hip replacement surgery my regular insurance wouldn't fully cover. Do you understand what that means at 67 years old? To be told the money you need for your own body, your own mobility, your own dignity, is now locked behind a debt you never agreed to? I remember sitting in my orthopedic surgeon's office. A kind man named Dr. Ahuya, who had done my knee years before and who looked genuinely troubled when his billing coordinator came in to explain that the financing option I'd been counting on had fallen through due to a recent negative mark on my credit report. I remember the particular humiliation of having to explain to a stranger in scrubs that my own daughter-in-law had taken out a fraudulent loan in my name for a recreational vehicle, and watching his face shift from confusion to something like pity, which might have been worse than confusion. I went home that day and iced my hip on my own kitchen floor because I couldn't afford the surgery yet, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Harold's funeral. Not delicate tears, ugly, gasping ones, the kind that come from somewhere much older than the actual event that triggered them. I also stopped going to my regular Thursday bridge group for almost a month, telling the girls I had a cold, then a stomach bug, then a scheduling conflict, because I could not bear the thought of sitting across a card table making small talk about grandchildren and vacations, when my own financial world had been quietly detonated by someone wearing my family's last name. I called Gary every day that week. Some days he answered and told me he was working on it. Some days he didn't answer at all. When I finally drove to his house, unannounced, on a Thursday afternoon, I found the RV parked right there in the driveway, gleaming white with a blue stripe down the side, hooked up to God knows what, with a child's booster seat visible through the window and a magnetic sign on the back that said, "The Turner Family Adventures" in cursive script. Lauren came out onto the porch when she saw my car. She was wearing yoga pants and holding a green smoothie, and she had the audacity, the absolute audacity, to smile at me. "Rebecca," she said, "I know you're upset, but it's already done. The RV is already purchased. Getting angry isn't going to unbuy it." "Where is my son?" I said. "At work." "Look, can we just talk about this like adults? I really think you're being a little dramatic about this. It's just money. You have money. You've always had money. Gary told me you own your house outright. You have savings. You have your pension. This is like a drop in the bucket for you." I looked at this woman, this 34-year-old woman standing on my son's porch in expensive leggings, sipping a smoothie that probably cost more than my grocery budget for the week, telling me that $120,000 of fraudulent debt in my name was a drop in the bucket, and something in me went very, very quiet. Not defeated quiet, calculating quiet. I want to be honest with you about what happened in my heart in that moment, because this is not going to be one of those stories where sweet old grandma just cries and forgives everybody and everyone hugs it out by the campfire. Not yet. Not for a long while. Because standing on that porch, I understood something clearly for the first time. Lauren did not see this as theft. She saw it as access. She believed, somewhere deep down, that my life, my credit, my hard-earned safety net, existed as a resource for her to tap whenever her own choices ran short. And people like that, in my experience, people who believe access is owed to them, they do not stop after one time. They escalate, unless someone stops them. So I smiled back at her. I said, "You're right, Lauren. Let's talk about this like adults." And I got back in my car, and I drove home. And I did not cry. I made a plan. The first thing I did was call my late husband's old friend, a woman named Diane Whitcomb, who had spent 30 years as a paralegal specializing in financial fraud before she retired, and who used to come to our 4th of July barbecues every single year until Harold died and the invitations quietly stopped, the way they do. Diane picked up on the first ring, and when I told her what had happened, I could hear her set down whatever she was holding. "Rebecca," she said, "I want you to write down everything. Every date, every phone call, every text message, before you do anything else. And then I want you to come to my house tomorrow morning with coffee, because we have work to do." I did exactly that. I printed out the loan application from the online portal. I printed the screenshots of my credit report before and after. I wrote a timeline. I found, buried in an old email folder, a message from 8 months earlier, an email I'd nearly forgotten, from Lauren, asking me to double-check some account information for a surprise family trip fund. She said she was setting up an email where she'd ask for my social security number just so the bank doesn't flag it as suspicious activity when we link accounts. I remembered feeling a small flicker of unease when I typed that number into a reply 8 months ago. And I remembered pushing that unease down because she was my son's wife. Because Dylan called her mommy. Because I wanted so badly to be the kind of mother-in-law who trusted easily. Diane read that email 3 times. "This is premeditated," she said quietly. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, Rebecca. She planned this months in advance. And I'd bet my paralegal license this isn't the first time she's done something like this." Diane also walked me through the loan file line by line, and she pointed something out that made my stomach turn all over again. The application listed a monthly household income nearly double what I knew. Gary's contracting business actually brought in padded, she suspected, with numbers that didn't match any tax return Lauren could have legally provided. "This wasn't just identity theft," Diane said, tapping the page with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "This is income fraud stacked on top of identity fraud. She didn't just borrow your name, Rebecca. She built an entire fictional financial picture to make the loan sale through underwriting without a second look." That sentence sat with me for days. Not the first time. So I did something I'm not entirely proud of, and something I would do again in a heartbeat. I started looking into Lauren Boyd's history. Not obsessively, not illegally, just carefully, the way any woman protecting her family would. I called her mother, whom I had met exactly twice, both times briefly. Both times with a strange tension in the air I hadn't understood then. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman named Carol living 2 states away, was hesitant at first, but when I explained what had happened, there was a long pause on the line, and then she said something I will never forget. "Rebecca, I love my daughter, but she did something very similar to her father and me 6 years ago. A car loan. We found out when the repo truck showed up in our driveway. We paid it off ourselves rather than have it go to court, because we didn't want the shame of it becoming public. And we told ourselves it was a one-time mistake, that she was young, that she'd learned her lesson. I am so sorry nobody warned you." Carol also told me, in that same phone call, about a second incident I hadn't known to ask about. A store credit card opened in Carol's late sister's name, 2 years after the aunt had passed away, discovered only when a collections letter arrived at a house that had already been sold. Nobody in the family had ever reported it. They'd simply paid the balance quietly and agreed, without ever quite saying it out loud, not to speak of it again. Hearing that, I understood something with total clarity. Every single person who had ever quietly absorbed one of Lauren's financial decisions had, in their own well-meaning way, taught her that there would always be a safety net, that the people who loved her would rather swallow the cost themselves than risk the discomfort of holding her accountable. I was not willing to be one more thread in that safety net. I hung up the phone and I sat in my quiet house, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Something between grief and fury. A combination I don't think has a proper name in the English language. Because this wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. A pattern that had been quietly covered up, absorbed, and forgiven by everyone who loved Lauren enough to protect her from consequences. And now I was expected to be the next silent absorber. The next woman who quietly paid so the family peace could be preserved. I decided right then that I would not be the next one. Diane helped me file an official police report for identity theft and financial fraud. Not the vague "someone stole my identity online" kind of report, but a specific, documented report naming Lauren Boyd Turner as the individual who filled out the application, supported by the forged signature, the 8-month-old email establishing premeditated access, and a formal handwriting analysis that Diane arranged through a forensic document examiner she still knew from her working years. The examiner's report was unambiguous. The signature on the loan documents showed significant indicators of simulation rather than authentic execution, meaning someone had practiced copying my signature rather than actually being me. While that process moved forward, slower than I wanted but steadily, I also contacted the RV dealership directly. A place called Lakeside Motor Coach about 40 minutes from Gary's house. I spoke to their finance manager, a man named Chris, who went very quiet when I explained the situation and then transferred me to their internal fraud liaison. I learned something important in that call. The finance company backing the loan had a strict fraud clause, and if identity theft was confirmed through police report and forensic evidence, the loan would be voided. The debt would be zeroed out on my report, and the RV itself would be subject to immediate repossession as it had effectively been purchased under fraudulent financing, meaning Lauren and Gary had no legitimate legal claim to keep it. I also sat down, at Diane's suggestion, with a detective from our county's financial crimes unit, a soft-spoken man named Detective Alvarez, who had clearly seen 100 cases like mine and treated it with a seriousness that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like I wasn't crazy for being this upset. He asked me detailed questions about my relationship with Lauren, about how often she'd had access to my home, my computer, my mail, and it was in answering those questions out loud that I remembered something I had buried without realizing it. A weekend 8 months earlier, when Lauren had offered to help me organize my home office while I recovered from a minor flu. A weekend where she'd spent nearly 6 hours alone in that room while I slept upstairs. A weekend I had thanked her for afterward because the filing cabinet looked so tidy. Detective Alvarez wrote that down without changing his expression, but I saw him underline it twice. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I know some of you are thinking, but Rebecca, isn't this a little extreme? Going after the RV itself, involving the police, digging into her past. And to that I say, extreme is what you call it when someone else does what needed to be done and you weren't the one who had to live through it. I had a hip surgery I couldn't get financing for. I had a credit score in the 600 seconds at 67 years old, through no fault of my own. I had a daughter-in-law standing on a porch calling my devastation a drop in the bucket. If that isn't extreme, I don't know what is. The repossession happened on a Sunday afternoon. I did not orchestrate the timing. That part was simply the finance company's schedule once all the fraud documentation was finalized. But I will admit, when Diane called to tell me the date, I felt something close to peace for the first time in 6 weeks. I heard about what happened secondhand, from Gary, in a phone call 3 days later where his voice sounded like it belonged to someone 20 years older than him. Apparently they'd been getting ready to leave for what Lauren had planned as a surprise weekend trip with Dylan, packing snacks and pillows into the RV in the driveway, when a flatbed tow truck pulled up alongside 2 men in official vests. Neighbors were out watering their lawns. Neighbors who had, according to Gary, been hearing about the beautiful new RV the Turners bought for weeks. Lauren reportedly stood in the driveway screaming that there had been some kind of mistake, while the men calmly explained they were acting under a fraud-related repossession order and had all the legal documentation to proceed. Dylan cried. Gary stood frozen on the porch, and within 40 minutes, the $120,000 RV, the one that was supposedly for family memories, rolled backward down the driveway on a flatbed truck in front of every single neighbor on that street. A neighbor of Gary's, a kind older gentleman named Mr. Petrocelli, who had known Harold years ago through a mutual friend, actually called me that same evening, unprompted, just to check on me, because word travels fast on a quiet suburban street, and he'd recognized my son's address from something Gary had mentioned once at a block party. He described the scene in more detail than Gary ever would have. Lauren on her knees in the driveway at one point. Not out of anguish exactly, Mr. Petrocelli said, but out of sheer disbelief, saying over and over that there had to be paperwork somewhere proving this was a mistake, while one of the tow operators, patient but unmoved, simply held up a clipboard and pointed to the case number. He said Dylan had been crying not because he understood what was happening, but because his mother was crying, and that image, my 4-year-old grandson standing in a driveway confused and frightened because the adults around him were falling apart, is a piece of this whole story that still catches in my throat even now. 2 years later, I will not pretend I felt nothing but righteousness hearing this story. Part of me, a very human part, felt something close to satisfaction, the kind you feel when a scale that has been unfairly tilted for weeks finally snaps back level. But another part of me, the part that is still a mother even though my son is 41, ached for Gary standing on that porch, humiliated in front of his neighbors for a decision he never made himself. The fallout in the following weeks was significant. The finance company, satisfied by the forensic and police evidence, formally voided the loan and issued a fraud clearance letter that I forwarded to all 3 credit bureaus. Within another billing cycle, the debt vanished from my report entirely, though I'll tell you, credit scores don't bounce back overnight even after an error is corrected. Mine took nearly 4 months to fully recover, and in that time I still couldn't get financing for my hip surgery, which meant I lived in significant pain for months longer than I should have. Walking with a cane I hated, unable to garden, unable to play on the floor with Dylan the way I used to. That is a piece of this story that never makes it into the satisfying part. The quiet cause that lingers after the dramatic scene is over. But the legal consequences for Lauren were only beginning, because I had filed a formal police report, and because the evidence was so clear-cut. The district attorney's office in our county decided to pursue charges, identity theft and financial fraud, involving an amount over $100,000 is not a minor offense in this state. Lauren was formally charged with felony identity theft and financial exploitation of an elder, that last part stinging in a way I hadn't expected. Elder, a word I never applied to myself before, a word that suddenly meant something legally protective and something personally devastating all at once. There was also a preliminary hearing about 6 weeks before the plea deal was finalized, and I remember Gary calling me the night before, his voice tight, asking me if there was any way I could just let this go now that the RV is already gone. Hasn't she lost enough? I told him, as gently as I could manage, that losing an RV she had no legal right to in the first place was not the same as facing consequences for defrauding an elderly family member, and that if I dropped the charges now, the message she would receive, the message every young person in our family watching this unfold would receive, was that consequences are negotiable if you cry hard enough or apologize sincerely enough. I told him I loved him, and that I loved Dylan, and that this was exactly why I was not backing down. Because I wanted Dylan to grow up in a family where doing the right thing mattered more than doing the comfortable thing. I want to tell you about the day I saw her in court, because it is burned into my memory in a way few things are. Lauren, who had always dressed like she'd stepped out of a catalog, wore a plain navy dress and no makeup, and she looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely afraid. Gary sat 2 rows behind her with Dylan's babysitter watching him at home, and he would not look at me when I walked in. That hurt more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. My own son, unable to meet my eyes, caught between the woman he married and the mother who raised him. The proceedings took months, the way these things do. There were pretrial hearings, There was a plea negotiation. There was a period where Lauren's lawyer tried to argue that this was a family financial miscommunication rather than criminal fraud. An argument that fell apart the moment the forensic handwriting report and the 8-month-old premeditation email were entered into evidence. Eventually, facing the likelihood of a felony conviction and real prison time given the amount involved and the elder exploitation enhancement, Lauren accepted a plea deal, a felony conviction with a suspended sentence contingent on 5 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, community service, and most importantly to me, a court-ordered restitution agreement, requiring her to personally repay every cent of associated costs I had incurred. My credit repair fees, my forensic examiner fees, the interest charges that had accrued before the fraud was confirmed, and a portion of the difference between what I could have earned on the home equity loan I was denied and what my hip surgery ultimately cost me when I finally paid for it in cash from savings I'd been keeping for my own final years. Before the sentencing was finalized, the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, and I said yes without a moment's hesitation. Though Diane warned me it might be one of the hardest things I'd ever done, I wrote it out longhand at my kitchen table the night before, crossed out more sentences than I kept, and when I stood up in that courtroom, my hands were steady in a way I hadn't expected them to be. I told the judge that I had spent 37 years building a life defined by careful, quiet responsibility, that I had raised my son alone for the last portion of his childhood after his father's heart gave out too early, that I had never once in my adult life missed a payment, never once carried a balance I couldn't cover, never once needed anyone to rescue me financially, and that this specific kind of theft, committed not by a stranger but by someone I had welcomed into my family with an open heart, had cost me something far more expensive than $120,000. It had cost me 8 months of pain I didn't need to endure while waiting for a surgery I couldn't finance. It had cost me the easy, uncomplicated trust I once had in my own daughter-in-law. It had cost me weeks of estrangement from my only grandchild during a period of his life I will never get back. Because 4-year-olds do not wait patiently for adults to sort out their conflicts. They simply grow, with or without you in the room. I told the judge that I was not asking for cruelty, only for accountability. Because I believed, and still believe, that real love sometimes looks like refusing to make things easy for the people you love most when they have done something that requires them to actually change. I sat back down and Gary, for the first time since this entire nightmare began, reached over 2 rows and squeezed my hand. It came to just under $19,000 every month for the following 3 years. An automatic payment landed in my account. A small, steady, mathematical apology that Lauren could not talk her way out of, could not charm her way around, could not explain away with a smoothie in her hand on somebody's porch. Now, here is the part of this story that I know some of you are waiting for, and I promise you, we are getting there, but I need you to understand what came before it. Because forgiveness that comes too easily isn't really forgiveness. It's just avoidance wearing a nicer outfit. For nearly a year, my relationship with Gary was fractured in a way I had never experienced with my own son. He believed, for a long time, that I had destroyed his marriage and humiliated his wife and traumatized his son by pursuing charges instead of quietly absorbing the debt the way I later learned Lauren's own parents had done 6 years earlier. We had a terrible fight in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this whole nightmare began, where he told me I cared more about being right than about keeping our family together. And I told him, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that a family built on the expectation that grandma will silently pay for whatever mess is made isn't really a family at all. It's a transaction. And I refuse to be the transaction anymore. He said things that night I know he regrets now, and some of them I still hear echoing in quiet moments, the way old wounds do. He told me I had always favored control over connection, that I had never really let Lauren in, that maybe if I had been warmer, more open, less watchful from the start, none of this would have happened, as if my caution had somehow provoked the fraud rather than the fraud itself being the problem. I remember standing at my own kitchen counter, gripping the edge of it, and asking him one simple question. Gary, do you actually believe that? Or are you just repeating something Lauren said to you? He didn't answer. He just grabbed his jacket and left. And the sound of my own front door closing behind my son is a sound I don't think I will ever fully forget. For those 6 weeks, I threw myself into small, useless projects to keep from calling him every hour the way I wanted to. I repainted my back porch. I reorganized every closet in my house twice. I started and abandoned 3 different jigsaw puzzles. Nancy came by most evenings with a bottle of wine we mostly didn't drink, just to sit with me so the silence in the house had another body in it besides my own. My phone stayed quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like punishment. I would catch myself picking it up to check if I'd somehow missed a call. Though of course I hadn't, because I checked that phone the way other women my age check the weather, out of habit more than expectation. I did send Gary one text message during those 6 weeks. A single message I agonized over for 2 full days before sending. It said only this: I am not angry that you love your wife. I am asking you to also still be my son. Both things can be true. He did not respond. I told myself that was all right, that some seeds take a long time to grow. Though there were nights I did not believe my own reassurances at all. He didn't speak to me for 6 weeks after that. 6 weeks during which I did not see my grandson. During which Dylan's 4th birthday came and went without me there. A wound that still aches when I think about the cake I made and froze, waiting for an invitation that didn't come. What brought us back together? Slowly, wasn't a dramatic apology or a single conversation. It was time. And it was Dylan, who apparently kept asking where Grandma Beck had gone, why she wasn't at his birthday, whether she was mad at him. Gary told me later that hearing his 4-year-old son ask if his grandmother stopped loving him broke something open in him that all the arguing between us never could. He showed up at my house on a Sunday afternoon almost 7 weeks after the fight, alone, without calling first. And he sat at my kitchen table and put his head in his hands and told me he was sorry, that he'd spent the last year making excuses for Lauren because it was easier than admitting he'd married someone capable of doing what she did. That admitting the truth about her meant admitting something uncomfortable about his own judgment. And it was easier to be angry at me than to sit with that. We talked for almost 3 hours that Sunday afternoon, longer than Gary and I had really talked, in years. He told me things about his marriage I hadn't known. That Lauren had grown up watching her own parents fight constantly about money. That she had a habit, one he'd noticed early on but never fully confronted, of solving financial stress not by talking about it openly, but by quietly maneuvering around it. Applying for cards, moving numbers, hoping problems would resolve themselves before anyone noticed. He told me he had known, on some level, that something wasn't right with how the RV had appeared so suddenly. That he had asked her once, early on, how they could possibly afford it. And she had told him not to worry about the details. That she had it handled. He admitted he hadn't pushed harder because he hadn't wanted to know the answer. Because some small selfish part of him had wanted the RV, wanted the family trips, wanted, for once, to give his son the kind of childhood memories he felt his own contracting business could never quite afford on its own. I did not yell at him for that admission, though an earlier version of myself might have. Instead, I told him something Harold used to tell me, back when we were young and broke and figuring out our own marriage. The truth is rarely comfortable, but it is always cheaper in the long run than a lie you have to keep paying interest on. Gary laughed, a small, tired laugh. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in months, and said that sounded exactly like something his father would say. I want to tell you, that conversation meant more to me than any of the legal victories, more than the repossession, more than the restitution payments landing in my account each month, because I did not go through any of this to punish my son. I went through it because I refused to let my daughter-in-law's choices define the rest of my financial and emotional life. And because somewhere along the way, without my son ever having to say it out loud, he needed to see his mother stand up for herself, so he understood it was allowed. So he understood love and boundaries were not opposites. In the months between the sentencing and that birthday party, I saw Lauren only in passing, at drop-offs and pickups when I babysat Dylan on Wednesday afternoons. Brief, polite exchanges at the front door that neither of us tried to extend. I heard about her progress secondhand, through Gary mostly, sometimes through small details Dylan would mention without understanding their weight. Like the time he told me proudly that Mommy has a job now helping Grandpa Frank at the hardware store. A detail that meant more to me than Dylan could have known, because it told me Lauren had gone from unemployed, or underemployed in whatever capacity she'd been before, to holding a steady job with regular, traceable income. The exact opposite of the fabricated income figures Diane had found on that fraudulent loan application. I also learned, through the court-mandated financial counseling updates that were part of her probation and that Gary occasionally shared with me when he thought it might help repair things between us, that Lauren had been diagnosed during that counseling process with what her counselor described as a compulsive financial avoidance pattern rooted in the chaos of her childhood. Not an excuse, her counselor was careful to note in the report, but a contributing factor that therapy could actually address if she did the work honestly. Lauren attended 2 sessions a week for the first 6 months, then weekly for the remainder of her probation period. And unlike so many court-mandated programs people simply show up to and coast through, Gary told me she actually did the homework, actually kept the spending journal her counselor assigned, actually called him, sometimes in tears, when she felt the old urge to solve a problem by hiding it rather than voicing it. There was one specific incident, about 8 months after the sentencing, that Gary told me about with something like wonder in his voice. Their water heater had broken, a genuine emergency. $900 they didn't have sitting around. The old Lauren, Gary said, would have quietly put it on a card neither of them had discussed, or worse, found some creative way around asking permission at all. Instead, she'd sat him down that same evening, laid out their actual bank balance on the kitchen table, and said plainly, "We don't have this. I don't know what we do, but I'm not hiding it from you and I'm not going around you to fix it." They ended up borrowing the money properly, transparently, from Gary's brother-in-law, with a written repayment plan they both signed. It was such a small, unglamorous moment, Gary said, nothing like the dramatic reckoning of the RV, but it was the moment he finally started to believe something in her had actually shifted. As for Lauren, I did eventually see her again, nearly a year after the repossession, at Dylan's 5th birthday party, which I attended because I refused to let Dylan grow up thinking birthdays were battlegrounds. She approached me by the drink table, and I watched her visibly steady herself before speaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I'm not even sure I've forgiven myself yet. But I wanted you to know that going through the financial counseling, actually having to sit in a room every week and talk about why I do what I do with money, why I've always believed other people's resources were somehow available to me if I just found the right way to ask, or not ask, it's changed something in me. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted to say it." I did not hug her. I did not tell her all was forgiven in that moment, because that would have been a lie, and I have never been in the business of telling comfortable lies. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I told her that the only thing that would ever rebuild any trust between us was not words but years, consistent, boring, reliable years of her simply being honest, and that I intended to watch closely. She nodded, and then she said one more thing before we were interrupted by Dylan tugging at her dress demanding cake. She said, "For what it's worth, I think about that email I sent you, the one asking for your social security number for the surprise trip fund, more than anything else from that whole period, because you trusted me enough to just give it to me. You didn't even ask a single follow-up question." And I remember feeling, in that moment, almost disappointed that it had been so easy. Like some small part of me had wanted you to say no, wanted someone to stop me before I went through with it, and nobody did. That's not your fault. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because I think about how differently things might have gone if just one person along the way had made it harder for me instead of easier. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and we stood there together in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like a standoff and more like two people simply being honest in the same room. Over the following year, small things accumulated the way trust actually rebuilds. Not in one grand gesture, but in 100 unremarkable ones. Lauren began sending me photos of Dylan's report cards without being asked. The kind of small, transparent sharing that once would have felt unremarkable but now felt significant, precisely because there was no financial angle attached to it. Nothing to gain. She asked my opinion before making decisions rather than after. Small things at first. What to get Gary for his birthday, whether a particular daycare seemed reputable, and slowly, larger things, whether they should refinance their actual legitimate mortgage. A conversation she insisted on having with all three of us in the room. Paperwork, spread across my kitchen table in the daylight instead of hidden in some drawer. I also noticed she stopped making jokes about money the way she used to. The offhand comments about how rich people worry too much about every penny, or how you only live once, that used to make me quietly bristle, without fully understanding why. In their place was something more careful, more respectful of the fact that money, real money, hard-earned money, is not an abstraction. It is time and labor and risk that someone chose to convert into safety. And spending someone else's without asking is not adventurous or spontaneous. It is theft dressed up in a nicer word. It has been 2 years now since that RV rolled backward down my son's driveway on a flatbed truck in front of the whole neighborhood. My credit score sits at 799 today. Not quite where it was, but close enough that I stopped checking it every single month out of anxiety and went back to checking it out of habit. My hip is healed. I garden again. Lauren has completed her restitution payments in full, every single one on time, and she completed her probation with, according to her caseworker whom the court required updates from, an exemplary record. She and Gary are still married, still working through what all of this did to their foundation, attending couples counseling that I know for a fact she initiated herself. A detail Gary mentioned almost sheepishly, like he still couldn't quite believe it. The woman who once hid an entire loan application from him, now the one insisting they sit across from a therapist twice a month and say the uncomfortable things out loud, instead of letting them fester in silence the way so many marriages quietly rot from the inside. He told me once, over coffee at that same diner Nancy and I have gone to for decades, that the strangest part of the whole ordeal was realizing his marriage had actually become more honest after the worst thing that ever happened to it. That some relationships need to hit an absolute floor before anyone involved is willing to do the real, unglamorous work of rebuilding something sturdier than what came before. I don't know if every single marriage survives a betrayal of that particular size and shape. And I told him plainly, honestly, that I wasn't going to pretend to have a crystal ball about his. But I do know that the version of his marriage I see now, imperfect, still healing, but honest, is a stronger foundation than the shiny, secretive one that could produce $120,000 surprise in the first place. Dylan is 6 now, and he still calls me grandma back, and he still has his great-grandfather Harold's exact laugh. And last month, for the first time, Lauren asked me genuinely, humbly, if I would help her set up a proper savings account for Dylan's college fund. One with my name nowhere on it. One entirely her own responsibility. And I said yes, because watching someone actually try, sustained and unglamorous and unrewarded try, is different from watching someone charm their way out of consequences. And I know the difference now in a way I didn't before all this happened. A difference I hope none of you ever have to learn the way I did. The hard way, at a kitchen table, at 67 years old. We sat together at my kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, it seems, where every important moment of this story has taken place. And I walked her through opening a proper custodial account, explained the difference between a 529 plan and a regular savings account, showed her how automatic monthly transfers work so the saving happens quietly in the background instead of requiring willpower. Every single month, she listened the way a student listens to a subject she's finally decided matters, taking notes on the back of an envelope because neither of us could find a proper notepad, asking questions that showed she was actually absorbing the information rather than performing interest for my benefit. At one point she looked up and said, half joking, half not, "You know, if you'd sat me down and taught me this 8 years ago instead of me being too embarrassed to ask, none of this might have ever happened, I told her. Embarrassment is a terrible reason to make a decision that follows you for the rest of your life. And that I hoped, whatever else came of all this, Dylan would grow up in a house where money was talked about plainly, without shame and without secrecy, because shame is exactly the soil that kind of financial recklessness grows best in. Before she left that day, she paused at my front door, Dylan already halfway to the car with his backpack dragging behind him, and she turned back and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me completely. I know you had every right to." I told her the truth, which is that I very nearly did give up completely. That there were nights during that first terrible year when I told Nancy I never wanted to see her at another family gathering again, as long as I lived, and that what changed my mind wasn't a single dramatic moment, but the slow accumulation of 100 small honest ones. The water heater conversation, the report cards, the job at the hardware store, the way she now asks instead of assumes. I told her trust rebuilt after a betrayal like this one is never the same shape as it was before. It's thinner in some places and, strangely, thicker in others, tempered by the fact that both people involved now know exactly what the worst version of each other looks like, and have chosen deliberately to keep showing up anyway. I finally went back to my Thursday bridge group about 2 months into all of this, and I remember Nancy and the other girls, Patricia and old Mrs. Featherstone, who's been playing cards with us since before Harold and I even bought this house, gathering around me the moment I walked in, wanting every detail. I told them the whole story, the phone call, the forged signature, the RV rolling backward on a flatbed truck, and I watched their faces move through disbelief, then outrage on my behalf, then gradually, something like admiration. I hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with Mrs. Featherstone, who is 81 years old and has buried 2 husbands, and outlived a fraudulent contractor who once tried to swindle her out of her roof repair money, reached over and patted my hand and said, "Rebecca, I have known you for 30 years, and I have never once seen you fight for yourself the way you fought for that little boy's future. Don't you dare apologize to anyone for it." That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything a lawyer or a judge said during the entire ordeal, because it came from a woman who understood, in her bones, what it costs a certain generation of women to finally stop absorbing other people's consequences quietly. I think often about why this particular betrayal cut so much deeper than an ordinary financial dispute might have. It wasn't only the dollar amount, though $120,000 is not a small thing to anyone, let alone a retired woman living on a fixed income. It was the fact that Lauren had access to me specifically because I trusted her, because I had opened my home, my Sunday dinners, my address book, my heart, to a woman my son loved, and she had converted that trust into a tool. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing that the openness you offered someone, the very quality that made you a warm and welcoming mother-in-law, rather than a suspicious, guarded one, was the exact vulnerability that got exploited. For a while, I worried that fighting back the way I did, hard, legally, publicly, might mean I would become cold and guarded for the rest of my life, unable to ever again open my door to someone new without running a background check first. But 2 years out, I don't think that's what happened. I think what happened instead is that I learned trust and vigilance are not opposites, that you can love someone with your whole heart and still expect them to show you, through actions, that they deserve continued access to your life, your resources, your name. I am not going to sit here and tell you I forgave Lauren easily, or quickly, or because some part of me believes family means you have to swallow whatever is done to you. I forgave her slowly and conditionally, and only after watching real change over real time, because that is the only kind of forgiveness that means anything. The kind that doesn't require you to pretend the wound never happened. Just the kind that allows you to keep living a full life alongside the person who caused it, once they've proven they understand the weight of what they did. I have come to believe forgiveness offered too quickly is often less about the person being forgiven and more about the discomfort of the person doing the forgiving, a desperate wish to skip past the messy middle part and arrive at peace without doing any of the work peace actually requires. Real forgiveness the durable kind. The kind that survives holidays and birthdays and every ordinary Wednesday in between. Has to be built the same way trust is built, brick by brick, proof by proof. And mine took 2 full years of bricks before I would call it a finished wall. I think too about the version of this story where I made a different choice. The version where I quietly absorbed the debt the way Lauren's own parents once absorbed her car loan. The way her aunt's family absorbed that store card opened in a dead woman's name. In that version, I imagine myself, 3 or 4 years from now, still making payments on an RV I never wanted, still watching Lauren's eyes flicker with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned, once again, that consequences are optional if the right person loves you enough to cover them. I imagine Dylan, older now, absorbing without ever being told directly that this is simply how the family operates. That grandma is a resource. That debts incurred by one generation simply get passed silently to the next. A lesson far more damaging in the long run than any temporary family tension could ever be. I did not want that version of the future for my grandson, and I decided, somewhere around that second cup of coffee at Diane's kitchen table, that I would rather be the difficult grandmother for 18 months than the compliant one for the rest of my life. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Loving your family does not mean losing yourself to protect their comfort. It did not make me a bad mother-in-law to pursue justice. It did not make me a bad mother to let my son sit in the discomfort of his own choices, instead of shielding him from it. And it certainly did not make me a bad grandmother to fight hard, methodically, and yes, extremely, for the financial safety that took me a lifetime to build. Safety that $120,000 recreational vehicle nearly destroyed in a single afternoon. People ask me sometimes, mostly other women my age who have heard some version of this story secondhand, at church or at the pharmacy or standing in line at the grocery store, whether I regret how far I took it, whether there was a gentler road I could have walked that would have spared everyone the courtroom, the repossession, the 6 weeks of silence from my own son. I tell them honestly that I don't regret a single step, not because I enjoyed any part of the conflict. I did not. I lost sleep and weight and hair during those months, more than I'd like to admit, but because I have watched what happens in families where the difficult choice gets avoided in favor of the comfortable one, and it is never actually kinder in the end. It only postpones the reckoning and raises the interest rate on it. In every sense of that phrase, somebody in every family eventually has to be the one who says, clearly and without apology, this is not acceptable. And I would rather that somebody be a 67-year-old grandmother with a paid-off house and nothing left to prove than a frightened young mother who doesn't yet know her own worth, or a tired husband caught in the middle who has convinced himself that keeping the peace matters more than keeping the truth. Every Wednesday afternoon, Dylan still comes to my house after his half-day at kindergarten, and we sit at that same kitchen table, doing homework or building something out of blocks or, lately, planting seeds in little paper cups on my windowsill, because he's decided he wants to grow a garden of his very own this summer. Sometimes he asks me questions that catch me off guard, the way children do, plain and unfiltered. A few months ago, out of nowhere, while coloring a picture of what I think was supposed to be a dinosaur, he asked me, "Grandma, why did the big truck take our camper away?" I told him, as simply and honestly as I could manage for a 6-year-old, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes with money, big ones, and that when that happens, there are rules that help make things fair again, and that his mommy had worked very hard to fix her mistake and make things right. He thought about that for a moment, the way he thinks about everything, with his whole small face scrunched in concentration, and then he said, "That's good. Mommy says sorry is only real if you actually change." I don't know exactly where he picked that particular phrase up, probably from Lauren herself, repeating something her counselor had told her at home one evening, filtered down through a 6-year-old's understanding into something remarkably close to real wisdom. And I sat there at my kitchen table and had to excuse myself for a moment to blink back, tears at the sink, because out of the mouths of babes, as they say, sometimes the whole moral of a very long, very painful story gets summed up in a single sentence you never expected to hear. I am 69 years old now. I have my house paid off, still mine. I have my grandson, who I see every single week. I have my son back, in a deeper and more honest way than I think we had before any of this happened. Because sometimes the truth has to break something before it can rebuild it stronger. And I have, believe it or not, a cautious but real relationship with the daughter-in-law, who once told me my devastation was a drop in the bucket. A woman who is slowly becoming someone I might actually trust again. Some nights, sitting alone in Harold's old recliner, with a cup of tea going cold on the side table, I still think back to that Tuesday evening. The collections woman's voice on the phone, the way my whole understanding of my own family shifted in the span of a single sentence. I think about how easy it would have been to choose differently at every single fork in that road, to let the debt sit quietly on my report and tell myself it was easier than a lawsuit, to let Gary's silence stretch into permanent distance rather than fight for the 6 weeks it took to bring him home, to accept Lauren's first smooth explanation on that porch instead of digging until I found the truth underneath it. Every one of those easier choices would have cost me more in the end than the hard ones did. And I think that's the real lesson buried inside all of this. Underneath the RV and the courtroom and the flatbed truck rolling down my son's driveway. The hard choice, the honest one, the one that risks the relationship in order to save it properly, is almost always cheaper in the long run than the easy one that only postpones the bill. I wrote all of this down. Every messy, uncomfortable, extreme piece of it. Not because I want anyone to think I'm proud of how far things went, but because I know there is at least one person watching tonight, sitting in their own kitchen, staring at their own version of a $120,000 phone call, wondering if they have the right to be as angry as they feel, wondering if fighting back will cost them their family entirely. I want that person to know it might, for a while. Gary and I lost 6 weeks we will never get back, but it did not cost me my family in the end. It gave me a truer, sturdier version of the one I already had, built on honesty instead of quiet avoidance. And I would trade every comfortable illusion for that truth again in a heartbeat. So tell me, before you go, where are you watching this from tonight? Put your city down in the comments below. I promise you I read every single one. And I love knowing how far these stories travel, how many kitchen tables and living rooms and late-night phone screens they end up on. And if you love your grandmother, if any part of this story reminded you of the strength it takes to stand up for yourself even when the people testing you are the ones you love most, then do an old woman a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share this with a friend who needs to hear tonight that it is never too late, and you're never too old, to protect what you built with your own two hands. I'll be right here next time, with my tea going cold and another story to tell, and I hope, wherever you're sitting tonight, that you carry a little piece of this one with you.